Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today we will talk about this week's G7 summit in Alberta, Canada, the first major multilateral summit of the second Trump presidency, and discuss the latest round of EU sanctions against Russia. Then we will turn to a conversation with Dr. Daniel Fiott, head of the Defense and Statecraft program at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, CSDS, of the Brussels School of Governance, to discuss the state of European defense and the EU's rearmament efforts. We hope you enjoy the show. Donatien, the G7 summit has just started. It starts when the Americans arrive, and Donald Trump, I've just seen his wheels down, is in Alberta, Canada. I think this summit is going to be really interesting. It's the first big gathering of America's major Democratic allies since Trump came back to office. So what do we expect to happen here?
Well, I think what's interesting here, we're expecting similar vibes, I think, as the last time there was a G7 when Trump was president, which is not overwhelming unity. I think that's the first step, and a very limited output. That means not a big communique. We already know this. A lot of people have talked to the press. People working on the prep for this summit have said there's not going to be this big 30-page communique. It's going to be a chair summary, just talking about what they talked about, basically. So that's what we know. I think what's interesting is kind of a brand new lineup of leaders here. Trump obviously is one of them, but on the European side, now we have Friedrich Merz from Germany. Keir Starmer is prime minister in the UK. I guess Emmanuel Macron is still around, but when is Emmanuel Macron not around? Prime Minister of Japan is different now. It's not someone that Trump has engaged with that much. And then, of course, Giorgia Meloni is now Prime Minister of Italy, and we know she has a good relationship with Trump. So it's a new lineup for the U.S. president to engage with. A lot of these allies are coming together at a time where their relationship with the United States is under a lot of pressure for multiple reasons, be it Ukraine, be it trade. These are all issues that are going to be discussed at the summit. A big question for me looking at the summit is this going to be the end of, putting the U.S. first among equals, putting it on a pedestal? As you said, it really starts when the U.S. president arrives. Let's see if on the ground it turns out that way.
What's really, I think, interesting over the last 4 years, the Biden administration had really taken the G7 summit and said, okay, this is going to be the kind of global steering committee. And we've seen the G7 over its lifetime, and this is, I think, the 51st year that it's been around, had been kind of the place where big global issues are discussed. So there was a lot of big development issues that were discussed at the G7. AI has been, discussed recently. This is supposed to be the place where the big, rich democracies get together. And this is always why it was a little weird that Russia was invited to join in the 1990s and then was kicked out, and why I went from the G8 back to the G7. But this is where the world's rich democracies get together to try to address the major global economic challenges. And I think the major question here is the big global economic challenge is the United States right now, where the United States, through the president's tariff policies, are causing real economic challenges and disruption, not just to America's adversaries, but to all the other G7 members. So how do they confront or discuss this, I think, is going to be a real question. And my guess is that this sort of looks a lot like the G7 summits during the first Trump administration, sort of an awkward family gathering. A lot of people don't really like each other, but no one's going to try to speak out of turn, or at least they're going to keep their thoughts to themselves, try to get through the big family dinner that's going to happen tonight, and then try to just sort of move on. I do think, though, that at some point there could be a real rupture in tension, but I don't necessarily think it's going to happen at this summit. I think it may be ones down the road. Next week, there's going to be a NATO summit. And there, I don't think you're going to see anything erupt either, because everyone's going to sign up to 3.5% or 5% of defense, whatever, to try to appease Trump. But at some point, U.S. force withdrawals are going to come. There's going to be real collisions. And then, there's going to be a moment where leaders stop being nice and start getting real. Or maybe it will never happen. That didn't really happen the first term, but that's sort of what we're looking out for. Does the passive aggressiveness drop, and does it just become sort of like a real world clip of some Ursula von der Leyen's throwing water at Trump or something like that? Do we have some real big spat emerge? I don't think that's going to happen here, but I don't think it's going to be a summit that really result in anything all that significant. And everyone's going to be looking for, what are the vibes coming from President Trump?
I think that's right. It's also because I agree with your take that the big clash is not coming now. It's early enough. People still want to go in trying to see what they can get out of this. It is also true that out of the topics that we know are going to be discussed, which is Israel's escalating war with Iran, trade, and Ukraine, the United States is the big unknown in all of these issues and actually a source of instability or a lot of questions in all of these issues. Trade obviously being the most prominent one. The United States didn't start this war with Iran and Israel, but it's being a lot more supportive of Israel than some of the other leaders that are coming to the summit. And same thing for Ukraine. So I think a lot of these leaders are coming into it thinking, as you were saying, just I don't know how to navigate this yet. I don't want to go from passive aggressive to full aggressive, but let's see exactly how it can unfold. Because as we saw, for example, in the NATO summit years ago during Trump's first presidency, there were a lot of questions going into it and it went pretty poorly, but it can go either way.
Yeah, I think for the EU and for EU states there, the question of how the Europeans approach the tariffs, there's been reporting coming out recently in the last few days that the EU may be willing to accept and just say, okay, we accept the 10% tariffs that you're going to put on us and basically go to the deal that the UK supposedly struck with the Trump administration, although we haven't seen that deal. And the Europeans were sort of mocking it, but now they're kind of going towards that as just sort of accepting that this is how things will be. And so we'll see if that happens. And there's been debates within the EU. Should you go, all Canada elbows up, or do you, sort of duck and cover more like what the UK has done? And I think it kind of makes sense that the EU would sort of duck and cover, frankly, as you're kind of waiting to see what transpires with the forced posture review coming out of the Pentagon. And I think those two issues are linked. One other thing, maybe to pivot a bit, is the EU has the European Commission come forth with an 18th round of sanctions on Russia. It would basically end the Nord Stream pipeline. This would also put in place stronger sanctions against Russia's oil sector, and importantly, try to bring down the oil price cap, which is set at $60 to, I think, 50 or 45, that was agreed to at the G7. And this has sort of been teed up for the G7 to talk about this. Zelensky is going to be there. And I think this is part of a European effort to sort of press Trump to see, where do you actually stand on Russia, Ukraine? Putin has obviously not conceded anything. He's not, moved forward on negotiations. So are you going to now take strong action against him? Merz tried this in his Oval Office meeting with Trump. Didn't really result in anything. I don't expect Trump to really make any big announcement on this, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's very much like, how do you want to address Russia, but also how long do you want to wait to see if Russia is, quote unquote, ready for peace? So I think those leaders are approaching this. But before we switch to the round of sanctions, I think the big question for me coming out of this summit will be, what are these meetings for if we find ourselves completely unable to reach consensus? And every year of the Trump presidency, because it's not nothing, it's going to be 4 years. Every year, we can't get a communique. It's just a series of joint statements on disparate issues. What is the point of a G7 if it can't speak in one voice? And, does it become an empty shell? And you and Dr. Victor Cha addressed this in the first episode of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department's new podcast, State of Play.
Good plug.
Of course, like and subscribe. But the first episode, you talked with Victor about the G7, but you also talked about purpose and potential expansion. And those are the things that, while not decided this week, that will be part of the conversation coming out of it is, what is this for?
One thing I didn't say on that podcast, Victor answered the question about where is this going. For me, I think the real sign of success is there going to be another G7 summit next year? And that actually, to me, I think is probably the end goal. Is to just keep the forum going. As Victor noted, the G7 matters to Trump, that he likes being at these clubs and likes being at these forums. So I don't see the U.S. sort of wanting to destroy the G7, but I think there is a question of how far you can push other G7 members, Canada in particular, other European countries, and sort of where this ends up. On the Russia sanctions package, I think this is also, to go back to that, a real sign of intent from the Europeans about where they are on Russia and wanting to sort of push Trump to really come around and adopt a stronger posture. I think they're going to be disappointed, but it's, I think, an important sign.
Yeah, I mean, these are pretty serious measures that are proposed out of this 18th round of sanctions, which sounds kind of crazy when you say 18th out loud. Also, because you'd think at some point we run out of things to put in a sanctions package,
right,
but we don't. So as you were saying earlier, some of the proposals in this sanctions round is to lower the price cap for the oil barrel from $60 to $45 a barrel, to remove more Russian banks from the SWIFT system. That means transactions across the world, refining oil in third countries, Nord Stream pipeline, cutting access to that. So it's a really serious package, and that matches the statements that we've heard from EU leaders who have said, like, we're taking this seriously.
Yeah, I think the other big thing is to just push us to get Europeans off Russian fossil fuels. Now, this is a problem for countries like Slovakia. Robert Fiott, who is not pro-Ukraine at all, has raised concerns, says he would veto this. I mean, it looks like he's looking for some sort of payoff. In some ways, you could argue somewhat reasonably. Slovakia, being a landlocked country, being totally dependent on Russian fossil fuels, needs to figure out a transition path. Probably should have been really thinking about that over the last few years. But I think it is a sign of intent. My guess is that the EU gets the yes on this. I mean, the one point to close out here is that we love to talk about how the EU is divided and the Hungarians, and I just talked about the Slovaks and how they could stop the EU from acting, and oh my gosh, and we're constantly fainting over the prospects of the EU being blocked. This is the 18th sanctions package. Every 6 months, the EU rolls over and renews sanctions package. Yes, the Hungarians will throw out, maybe we're not going to do it this time, maybe we're going to say no, and yet they do. And I think sometimes we need to focus on how the EU works and how the EU functions, as opposed to how things could always fall apart. And there's always this assumption that the EU will fall apart, and yet it doesn't. You know what's falling apart? Probably the U.S. sanctions efforts. Doesn't really seem like the U.S. is going to continue to ramp up sanctions, even though there's some talk about that in Congress. One of the reasons why you need to have these sanctions packages is that when you sanction something, you then realize how they can work around it, other things that are not caught in the web. And so it requires a degree of bureaucratic energy to then sanction again and again and again. And we're seeing that from the Europeans. And there's a real question of whether we're going to see that from the U.S.
I think it's important you raise the U.S. point because there's legislation that's been introduced in the Senate that's pretty stark, is tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil, like 500% tariffs. It's not looking super positive, the prospects of it passing, but it's an important sign that there's still willingness, at least in the legislative branch, to push sanctions forward. But I think you made an interesting point on sanctions and their utility. Partly is to see what kind of evasion emerges from new sanctions. Where do sanctioned countries try to go once those channels are cut off? But we've also had for the last few years, and honestly since 2014 and the first invasion of Ukraine, conversations around the effectiveness of sanctions. What do we use them for? What kind of tool of statecraft is it? Is it to actually change the behavior of a country, which it was supposed to be for a while? Now we're seeing that it's not. So it feels like we're starting to move towards sanctions being used mostly just ostracize a country for its behavior. Not assigning judgment on one or the other, but it feels like that's the shift. The measures that we're discussing here are quite intense. And that's a conversation that needs to continue, is what do we use sanctions for?
Well, we have a report out, and another plug from the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program on the Russian wartime economy from sugar high to hangover, which looks at the state of the Russian economy. And I think the basic conclusion is that, yes, sanctions have really played a role in attriting the Russian economy. And I think if you view every artillery shell given to Ukraine as a form of attriting the Russian military, sanctions have done something similar. What you shouldn't expect is just the rapid collapse and the adversary to just sit there and take it. They find workarounds. One of the kind of broader takeaways from the report is we shouldn't overstate how Russia's willingness to engage in talks because of their economic strain. They're now under real economic strain. They've experienced significant economic growth, in part due to kind of wartime Keynesianism and high energy prices, but those are now subsiding. So they're experiencing real strain, real budget issues, real challenges. And so the prospects for Russia aren't great, but it doesn't appear they're on the cusp of any major economic collapse anytime soon. And we shouldn't really bank on that. That said, even if the Trump administration were to sort of get rid of sanctions, and there's been talks between folks in Trump's orbit, the special envoy Wickoff, Commerce Secretary have gone to Moscow, Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, has come to the United States for discussions. But even if the Trump administration were to get rid of U.S. sanctions, what we find in this report is the effect is probably going to be fairly minimal, because what you're not going to see are Western businesses, particularly American businesses, rushing back into Russia to make investments, because, in a year and a half, you could have a Democratic Congress that says, the hell with this, we're going to pass a really brutal a piece of sanctions legislation, and then all that investment would be for naught. And that's some of the lessons that we've seen from Iran post JCPOA agreement, where, even with the sanctions being lifted, Western companies didn't go back in. We should say, right now Israel and Iran are at war. Prospects for increased oil prices clearly to the benefit of Russia. Oil prices now going back up over $70 a barrel. That will be of significant economic benefit and really help them from a fiscal standpoint going forward.
I think that's a great place to leave it and pivot to our conversation with Daniel Fiott. We are thrilled to welcome Daniel Fiott to the Eurofile. Daniel is head of the Defense and Statecraft program at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, CSDS, at Vrije Universiteit Brussels. At CSDS, he researches most aspects of European defense policy with an emphasis on defense industrial policy, capability development, and defense innovation. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Real Instituto Elcano, where he analyzes defense industrial issues. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So let's start big picture. How would you describe the progress that Europe has made on its own rearmament about 3 years into Russia's war against Ukraine? We've seen a lot of targets for munitions, procurement, a lot of conversations. It's in the news all the time. Where do you think we stand right now?
I mean, the good news is that at least leaders and industry know that they have to rebuild the European defense industry, right? So after about 2 or 3 decades of basically complacency, where, governments were spending smaller amounts of money on defense, and they were really investing in, I would call, the kind of small is beautiful concept, which is that you could go for highly specialized technologies that would, ensure that your militaries were able to perform very particular military tasks. And obviously, since the war started on Ukraine, the whole kind of concept of rearmament has come back onto the agenda in, I would say, quite a forceful way. I think maybe just to briefly answer that first question is just to make a distinction between the kind of political awareness of the need to invest in defense and then the actual progress, as you put it in your question. Those, I think, are still 2 different worlds, although it's very clear that the, larger industries within Europe and the defense sector are now starting to produce a lot more, but there are still a lot of frustrations. So money is being committed more and more, but we're not getting to the stage yet where governments are signing, contracts. They're not putting their pen to paper. And that's really what we need in order to really kind of stimulate this rearmament process.
And I should say that Daniel is one of the foremost experts on EU defense initiatives. You know all the acronyms, what's happened, where the progress stands. It seems like over the last 6 months, there has been a flurry of activity from the European Union, with the European Union in particular seeing a real space for itself in defense industrial coordination. There were initiatives, going back before this year, since the war in Ukraine began. How would you assess those initiatives right now? And in particular, they seem focused on trying to reduce the fragmentation of the European defense industrial base, get countries to buy together, create some economies of scale. How do you assess initiatives that have been sort of put forward over the last 6 months?
Yeah, thanks for that, Max, and also thanks for the kind words. I'd include yourself in being an expert on European defense as well, and not begrudgingly, which is a nice thing, right? Out of pure interest. I think it's a really good set of questions. I probably don't need to tell you, but at least for your audience, it might be worth reflecting on the fact that when we talk about the EU being involved in defense industrial policy, traditionally what that's meant is mainly law and regulation, right? So in about the mid-2000s, the EU came up with a package to try and deal with what you rightfully mentioned was fragmentation. The way that they thought they could do that, in particular the European Commission, was to try and break down some of the legal barriers between states within Europe. So it would be a lot easier to procure from each other, to develop with one another, and also to exchange technologies, right? So that's why we had this kind of legislative package, which was nicknamed the defense package, even though we hear that term quite frequently these days. That was the original term behind it. I think, as you and I have been monitoring actually over the last few years, the biggest change in all of this is money. A lot more money has come to the table. And the Commission started, I think, quite wisely and boldly with the European Defence Fund. Now, for many of us observing that fund, you could probably kind of ridicule it by saying, well, it's only 8 billion euros. And I think that's a kind of justified criticism. It's not a lot of money there. But when we look at what that tool has actually enabled, which is to really push, governments, research institutes, defense firms together in ways that they were not able to do in the past, right? So even though there's not that much money, the logic behind cooperation certainly did feed into responding to the fragmentation that you mentioned. And if you look at the data and statistics over the last, 4 or 5 years since it's been in motion, it's been really impressive how many different firms and institutes across Europe are actually cooperating with each other in ways that they never did in the past. And I think it's also important, given the strategic context, to keep in mind what type of capabilities they're developing, right? So if you start to look under the bonnet of the Defense Fund, you'll start seeing projects related to interceptor missile projects, for example, or cyber defense projects, or space satellite imagery projects. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But they're really trying to target, I think, some of the key military gaps and capability gaps that have been identified. If we fast forward, I think, to the last few weeks even, at least in the last month, we've also seen a kind of greater emphasis on the EU dimension for this. And again, that's still money, but we're now dealing with different scales of money, right? So when you look at the so-called loan facility, so the Securing Action for Europe, to give it its very boring Brussels acronym, if you look at that, that's 150 billion euros worth of loans if governments want it. And currently in Brussels, there's a negotiation for the defense industry program, which again could add multiple billions to the discussion. So it should all be seen within the context of, going from 2% to 5% spending of GDP. What is the EU's contribution to that? Even though the EU contribution is never really calculated in NATO figures very concretely. But there is a sizable contribution. So the EU has really gone from being a regulatory power with state-like features to try and enable that kind of defragmentation of the market. But on the other hand, there was a limitation there. So introducing money as an incentive, I think, has been really powerful. There is another thing that we should highlight, and that's just to briefly round off my response. And that is that the Commission is returning back to the regulation side of things now as well, right? So there's more money coming on the table. Actually, this week or maybe even next week, we will have the presentation of what's being called the Defence Omnibus, which is, again, a very boring EU jargon type description of essentially looking at all regulations that we have at the EU level and whether or not they pass the test of do they improve or enhance defence? Do they ensure that you can get member states cooperating a bit more with each other? And some of those examples are quite telling, right? So, again, you've probably been following this, but over the last few years, the EU has adopted a whole raft of regulations in the area of energy and environment, etc., right? But those regulations were developed without any consideration for defense. So we're getting a lot of ministries of defense and a lot of firms saying, look, you want us to produce more, but actually we're being hampered by a lot of regulations that we find to be a bit cumbersome for our business, right? So the Commission's going back to the kind of drawing board to see what can be simplified overall. So quite a big shift, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that over the last few years, I think the EU has emerged essentially the third largest investor in defense R&D after sort of France and Germany in the EU. That is making a real contribution. I want to maybe probe a little bit on the SAFE initiative or the EU rearm package that Ursula von der Leyen announced and now is making its way through the Brussels sort of sausage making factory of how a Commission proposal becomes a law. It strikes me that this was both very positive and represented a major step forward for the European Union, but also may just continue the current fragmentation that we see in defense procurement, because it was sort of two legs here. And please correct me if I'm wrong or you want to recharacterize something. But one was just effectively allowing member states to just start spending as much as you want on defense and not have that count to the Stability and Growth Pact and deficit rules. Like a US state, EU states are supposed to adhere to certain fiscal rules. They're supposed to break certain barriers. And this sort of says on defense, go forth. And that strikes me as positive, but it also strikes me as maybe just facilitating the fragmentation where every country just goes out and buys whatever they want. We've done a study here at CSIS that has shown that when states spend more in Europe, they cooperate less because, God forbid, you're the Dutch Ministry of Defense. Now you have to call up the Italian Ministry of Defense, and it's just too much of a pain. So you just buy whatever you want. So that strikes me as one problem with what the EU has done, that it facilitates more spending, but not the coordination. And the SAFE initiative doesn't really strike me as necessarily providing the incentives, a slightly better interest rate on borrowing. If you're the French, are you really going to take advantage of something that might lower your interest rate just a little bit? And now you have to deal with the European Commission. So I'm curious how you see that. Has the Commission sort of not really gotten to where it needs to be? And should these loans really be more like grants?
Yeah, no, I think you've just proven my point, Max, that you know more, if not the same amount as I do on defense. And what you just said actually reflects a lot of my own impulses. What you said at the beginning about the EU becoming one of the third largest investors in R&D is spot on, and actually shows you what can be done if you start investing at scale and through the European Commission. So I only see that as a positive thing, given that, a whole host of member states on their own just can't have that firepower alone, right? So that's a positive part of the story. I think what you said about the kind of Readiness 2030 package is also spot on. And here we have to kind of, although there are 5 or 6 pillars in the readiness package, I think the 2 that people know the most is, first of all, the safe loan facility, as we've just been speaking about, and then also the relaxation of the Stability and Growth Pact rules. And those rules, actually, a number of member states were arguing against them for so many years, right? And it was always the case that you had countries like, Italy in particular, but there were others saying, look, if you want us to increase defense spending, we can't, because then we'll go into debt and then you'll be breathing down our necks, so to speak. So in a way, it was the Commission kind of calling their bluff of saying, right, we are going to revise the rules now, and let's see if you actually follow through. There is a thing to be said about the context here as well, right? And that is, I don't think that the Commission would have been so bold on the Stability and Growth Pact rules if Germany hadn't taken its own national decision to rewrite its own debt rules, right? So there was a kind of window of opportunity there for the Commission to step through, which it did. Now, I think some of your concerns are also ones that I share, right? I think it's very, very true that if you're going to let member states just spend more and accrue more debt on defense, the payoff is, yes, you get maybe more capabilities, more investment in defense, and that's all good. That ticks so many boxes. But it doesn't really meet the challenge necessarily of defragmenting the market, right? So they're just going to have an excuse to be kind of hyper-nationalistic or continue what they've already been doing, which is to, buy wherever they want. They don't even have to buy European in this context. They can do all sorts of things to actually reinforce some of the negative aspects of the defense market in Europe. I mean, knowing a bit how the Commission operates as well, it has to give a kind of sweetener and then the kind of more bitter pill, if I can put it this way. And in order to get its overall package through, it did need to offer the member states, the relaxation within the rules. And effectively, it's called the bluff of member states, right? So if member states now don't make use of relaxation in the rules, then they were lying all along, right? They weren't really kind of hiding behind the Stability and Growth Pact. They were just not wanting to invest in defense, right? So in a way, it will call their bluff. On the loans, I think, there are some kind of conditionalities here. So we've gone to the familiar ground, which is that you have to have at least a kind of minimum of 2 states cooperating with each other before they can even apply for a loan, right? And as you rightfully said, not all member states will look at the borrowing rates and think they're more favorable than what they can get elsewhere. And for a lot of member states, they can just borrow a lot more cheaply. They don't have to go to the Commission for this. I think the realization, however, now, or at least the rationale has changed slightly, which is it's not just about the borrowing rates, but it's the preferential repayment, right? You have a 45-year repayment scheme. The first 10 years is highly preferential. You're not paying any interest payments at all. And effectively what the Commission is saying, you have a good bargain there in terms of the repayment of the loans. But also they are relying, and, this remains to be seen how far the member states bite on this. But there is the fact that the Commission is offering SAFE as a tool for member states to make good on what they keep on talking about, which is, we want to have the money there. We want to be able to take that money and invest in the industry. The Commission is furnishing them with this money now. So if they do apply for loans, it won't just be for the borrowing rates. It will be for a more politically grounded rationale behind that. There is one point, though, that we still need to think about as well, right? And that is that the relaxation of the SGP rules are linked to SAFE. And in the sense that, in the defense fund, the logic is that it's effectively a grant-making tool, right? So member states get money from the EU budget, and that shows up on their defense accounts very differently to a loan, because a loan is effectively expenditure. They've got to pay it back. So it will end up on their budget accounts as an expenditure. grants can be kind of subsumed in a very different way as part of the defense budget. So we're also having to think a little bit about how governments calculate these types of kind of mathematics behind it. But I mean, some of the signals in Brussels are quite positive with at least the safe regulation. It went through quicker than most people thought it would, actually. So I guess that's a kind of positive sign.
Earlier, you talked about the ability to not even buy European. I'm curious how you see the involvement of third countries in all of these discussions, because that's a pretty big part of it too, like getting Europeans to spend together. And if you're talking about relaxation of SGP rules, you have to give a carrot to European industry, also for European publics to justify these expenditures. As leaders, they have to say, well, here we're spending in Europe, creating European jobs, etc. Although, to be clear, foreign countries' industries also work in Europe. But I'm curious how you see the discussions these days on the involvement of third countries. We've seen different numbers, different percentages come out of the debates. And what are the implications of going one way or another on this involvement of third countries?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the EU approaches this from the logic that you're never going to stop individual member states from procuring non-EU sources of defense equipment, right? I mean, in the immediate aftermath of the war, what did Poland do? It didn't phone up France. It didn't phone up Germany. It went straight to Korea, right? So I think there is this logic that governments will do as they must in a very short term. And that will definitely be the case. And I mean, the figures that you were referring to, I mean, there are a whole bunch of them. But if you look, for example, at the CPRI data on this, they say that, dependence on US equipment within the EU has shot up from about 50 to 60% since the war, right? So there's obviously a dependency still there, and governments are still quite relaxed about doing that. But I think that should be contrasted with some of the targets that we find in the defense industrial strategy, where there is very clearly a target on behalf of the Commission to increase the level of domestic production and consumption of defense equipment as well. Let's be very honest, that will just take a lot of time. We're seeing more and more governments now, on the one hand, recognizing that they are dependent for a lot of military equipment. But on the other hand, they are starting to feel the kind of headwinds of that logic, which is that, even in the case of the US, right? You say you want to go to the US, you want to procure a certain amount of weapon systems. That's all brilliant. You pay your money. Then the problem is, well, supply chain security isn't as it should be at the moment, right? So what is the US going to do if it needs, F-35 fighters for its own armed forces? What happens to the queuing system there? Where are Europeans in the queue for that type of stuff, right? So there is a recognition that, even though you want to cooperate with non-EU states or third states, to give it its official term, there will be constraints there. So I think there will be a much more balanced approach to how we do this. What I think is really challenging is that the logic of continuing to be dependent on third states whilst developing the European defense market is still based on the premise that the US will always be there, partners will always be there will always be a supply of defense equipment. And I think some of us are asking the question, well, what if that logic doesn't hold in the future? Then what kind of shock are you going to expect within the European defense market? I think we all have the answer at the moment, which is the European defense market just cannot produce for all of the needs and equipment that we need. But the goal surely has to be in the future that we do have an industry that can produce that. And then on top of that, we tend to get stuck into this logic, possibly even at this moment because of the political context, of thinking of just, procuring off the shelf from third states. The conversation, which has not really started to get underway, I think, in a, let's say, more coherent way, is co-production, co-development, right? Which, if you look, for example, at a lot of close allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, they are really demanding much more in terms of technology sharing, co-production, co-development, right? That's not really a conversation we're having with the US, by the way, but it has to be put into the mix that it's not just about developing your industry, but also finding new ways of cooperating with partners around the world.
I think major developments really over the last year I've seen in the EU is that the economists, the people who deal with finance, people who really have the power within the European Union, it's not, defense analysts like yourselves, it's the econ folks are starting to get into this subject of the defense industrial base. You've seen in the Mario Draghi report last year, a whole section on the European defense industrial base. There was recently a report from Bruegel, from Guntram Wolf and colleagues calling for, I think, a really innovative approach, a common European procurement office or department. I think that would give heart attacks to anyone in the Parisian and the French Ministry of Defense. But I'm curious how you see the kind of wind blowing here. I mean, it does seem now you have kind of the EU technocrats, who I think in some ways are the best bureaucrats in the world, really starting to think carefully about this subject. How would you sort of assess intellectually how things have moved, and where do you think this is going? Where do you think the EU is going to be on defense? What are the things that you're watching out for? Is it the next EU budget? Are you still looking at how SAFE plays out? How have things evolved, and where do you think things are going?
Let me unpack them a bit, right? Because there are a few points here. I fully share your view on the wiliness and the intelligence of Brussels bureaucrats. They can solve problems as much as they can create problems. And they're really a wonderful class of people, I think. On this point, you're absolutely correct. We're getting new people who are looking over their shoulders at defense in ways that were not really foreseen in the past. And I think there are a number of reasons why this is the case, not just because there's more money. And of course, finance and economics ministers are more wary of how much they're spending on defense, right? But it's also because we've had the involvement of new actors like the European Investment Bank, for example, which, as you and I have been following that, if that truly unlocks, then there are even, multiple billions worth of further investment that could be used in defense. And if you're going to do that, you need bureaucrats and people who are thinking about this, right? I think in terms of the defense sector more generally, I think governments, finance ministers, the biggest challenge they face at the moment is not so much how much they want to stimulate European cooperation, although I think the majority of them are kind of convinced of the need to do that, not least because of economies of scale. But they have their own national conversations about how they balance different types of investments, right, between defense and social policy, education, etc. And in some member states, that's easier than others. I think if you're a frontline state looking at Russia over your border, that conversation becomes a lot easier than if you're in Spain, France, etc., etc. And in Europe, even though we've got much more defense spending, we're still facing quite a few fiscal pressures, I would say, right? So yes, we have new actors, we have new kind of interest involved in where this money is going, right? And in many cases, you might even want, finance ministers and bureaucrats looking more at this question, because I think at least the impression I get is that the more and more you involve kind of military constituencies, industry actors, they're all needed, of course, but you sometimes find that they can find problems where problems probably shouldn't exist, right? So sometimes the kind of hard, cold ruthlessness of budgeting and getting bang for buck is really important.
Well, just to interject quickly, it does seem that there's a bureaucratic problem, and it's not in Brussels. It's that you have 27 different national defense industrial complexes, and no national ministry of defense really wants to change. The Dutch want their coffee cup holder in their infantry fighting vehicle on the left, while the French one on the right. I don't know. Whatever it is, they all have their different requirements, and that creates a total mess when it comes to all the systems that the European defense industry sort of plops out. But no one wants that to change. European defense companies don't want that to change because they have cushy little arrangements, with whatever national capital they're in. Anyway, that's how I sort of see it. And so the finance ministers getting involved in this sort of complicates the lives, I think.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I mean, they are the most conservative actors in government, right? Ministries of defense and the military. And sometimes you don't just need the finance ministers, but you also need, to use that German expression, Chefsache. You need the heads of government to also bang the heads of industry, ministries, individuals, characters, etc., in order to push things through, especially if you are convinced that the long-term trajectory should be in more cooperation, right? That's certainly the case. I think, however, on your other question about where do I see this going, I mean, if you look at SAFE, if you look at the European Defence Fund, if you look at what's coming very soon with the defence industry programme, governments within the EU are, even though they talk about, partnerships with third states, openness of the market, etc., their kind of words and actions don't necessarily meet. And most of them are still convinced that the regulatory framework that is put in place behind a lot of these financial incentives are worth pursuing, right? And that does mean that the EU will develop, technology controls. It will mean that there will be, even if it's not stated policy, a kind of buy European or preference within this legislation. And if you speak to, for example, many of the people in the European Parliament, members of European Parliament, I mean, their one big issue is constantly taxpayer value for money and ensuring that, money from EU taxpayers goes to European firms, European jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So this logic is quite hard to overcome, I would say. Now, it's true at this moment, we see a lot of different kind of constellations of cooperation, right? And there is this idea as well that, what kind of structure can we create to keep the non-EU states in, right? UK being the primary one, but there's also a kind of subsidiary conversation about Turkey as well, right? And eventually Ukraine on top of this. I can see how those types of frameworks would be attractive, but I think in the current context, also with what's happening in the transatlantic relationship, there is this heightened sense of, no, we need to make sure that we hide behind the European Commission's regulatory shield on all of this. And the Commission is then pushed into the forefront politically on all of this. The member states tend to hide behind them. But I do think that insistence on technology control, on, security of supply is a feature that was not there before, but is becoming more and more heightened for various reasons, including, current situation with the US, but also other threats as well, including, Chinese manipulation of supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a whole host of factors which I think feed into more of a kind of coalition within the EU rather than in ad hoc arrangements.
So just final question for me before I turn it over to Etienne. So where do you see things going in like 5 years? Is the EU going to have a rather robust defense budget? It's 2030, 2035. Where do you think the European Union is as a defense actor?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the biggest debate we have at the moment is about the next budgetary cycle, right, which comes after 2027. And there you have the big conflict, which is should we increase the overall size of the budget, right? That's the first question. And then you have some member states who say, yes, we should increase it, and others who say, we certainly shouldn't increase it, should just stay at current cost rates. The other part, so the B part of that, is how much of the existing budget do you want to dedicate to defense? So we've seen some governments who have already been very clear that they don't want an overall increase in the budget, but they want more of that budget to go to defense. And then you have others who want more for defense, but they want an enlarged budget as well. So this is the biggest contest that we will face in the next few years. I think in terms of where we will go in 5 years' time, that's pretty interesting because I think there will be a lot of money on the table. I mean, that's for sure. So our issue will not necessarily be what money, what level of money, what level of spending. It will be more in terms of what we're doing with that money. And I think the big issue for Europeans is that if they do spend money and in the next 5-10 years, we don't see some visible payoff from that investment, then things will start to get very rocky indeed, right? So we need to get past the things that you and I do very well, Max, which is talking about the need for defense spending, right? And then to get to the kind of proof of the pudding, which is what have you actually invested in? My hope is that in the next 5 years, all of those politicians that love photo ops in planes and tanks will be able to do so in all of the new stuff that we build in the next few years.
The last piece I want to ask about is industry. So we've talked about Brussels, we've talked about national ministries, we've talked about the finance ministries, et cetera, and third countries. But industry obviously has a big role to play. Max mentioned the fact that some of them are very happy to have just long-standing contracts with individual member states because it guarantees, obviously, a supply of contract. But we're starting to hear from industry, we would like a long-term guarantee of contracts at this bigger scale. So there's clearly an appetite for a different kind of contract that involves multiple member states. How do you see their role playing out in current efforts to change European defense?
Yeah, I mean, the most positive thing is that they're willing to do it, obviously. I mean, they do want to engage in business. They do want to produce equipment. They do want to innovate. They want to do all of these things because that's what they're around to do, right? And actually a bit more than that, if you speak to your kind of regular industry figure, it's not just about profit margins and it's not just about all of the wonderful technology that they can develop, but more and more you see them strongly invested in the idea of protecting and defending Europe, right? They see it in their own kind of ethical sense, a need to defend Europe. So I think they're not just machines themselves or business people. They really do want to defend Europe. So that's a positive thing. But I think your question was to the point incorrect, which is that it's no good having an industry if we just keep promising contracts and don't sign them. And why are contracts so important? Well, I think you've already implied that, which is you need to plan for the long term, right? You need to have some consistency over the long term. And what that means from a business perspective is, look, if we're willing and able and ready to meet your demands, the two things that we need to be able to do is build manufacturing sites, so to help us with our production. We need all of the equipment that goes in those manufacturing sites. And the second thing we need is labor. We need people, right? We need skills. If you don't have those two things, you don't have an industry. And the problem we have in Europe is that we don't have a consistent level of finance over a long period of time so that firms can go away and say, look, we will recruit X number of people in these skill sets. We will produce this number of factories. We will invest in this amount of equipment. What we still have in Europe today, and that was very instructive in the surge for ammunition production, is a kind of scavenging industry, right? Where you have big firms who are basically trying to buy up capacity around the union, but existing capacity, right? So you have Rheinmetall buying factory in Spain, for example, and you're not producing any new capacity. You're just kind of, leeching off of what was already there. So we need these contracts to be able to develop all of these new production sites, get people into the sector as well. Now, one final point here, the people side is the hardest part of it. Because, as you know, in Europe, we've got some demographic problems, first of all. But second of all, we don't have people going into the STEM subjects, right? Into science, technology, math, etc. And those are the real skills that you need to be able to really develop an industry. As I do on a regular basis, speaking to industry, this is their number one concern, by the way, that they just can't recruit the right types of people at the right types of level across the European Union, right? So it will be a big issue, I think, for many industries, even when they do sign a contract.
Great. Well, Daniel, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining the Eurofile. It's been a pleasure to walk out with you on all things EU defense. Looking forward to having you back in the near future. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Max. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.